Hi, good evening everyone. Before I go too far into this, I'm just gonna make sure my sound is working. Before we get into this too far, just gotta make sure that everybody can hear me. All right, sounds good. This is the long extended version of the winter forecast. If you joined me on 21 News at 6 this evening, I did the 3-minute version, kind of real quick and dirty and to the point. If you're interested in just the basics and don't want any extra detail, don't need any extra detail, I recommend you go watch that video. This video will be longer. It'll be much more detailed. We're going to get into not only more detail about the forecast itself, but a lot of detail about how we come up with these forecasts and why we're forecasting, what we are forecasting this year. So without further ado, let's get right into it. This year promises to be somewhat different than last year. And, you know, it's been a little while since we've had just an average winter, and I'm going to show you the stats in just a second. But last year was anything but average. It was, of course, ridiculously warm last year. We, temperature-wise, 5.4 degrees above the average, and that actually matched the previous winter. We've had 2 straight really warm winters. Now, 69 inches of snow last winter, that sounds like a lot of snow, and actually, that's a little above average. I'm going to talk about why we ended up with above average snow last year despite how warm it was coming up in just a second. So that's a quick review of last year as far as the real basics go. A few of the specifics, some of the highlights of last winter. It was the warmest February on record. My birthday is in February, and I had lunch outside on my birthday. It was 75 degrees. It was just ridiculous. February was just remarkably warm. The months of January and February were not only warmer than average, but relatively snow-free. That's the heart of winter. And over that 2-month stretch in January and February, we only had about 19.2 inches of snow. That's not much. But I mentioned we had 69 inches of snow at the airport last winter. The reason it was so snowy when you look at the numbers at a glance is December and March were actually quite snowy. January and February were not, but we had the 4th snowiest December on record and the 8th snowiest March on record last winter, and that actually sent the numbers up to just a little above average in the snow department. Going back and taking a look at temperatures over the last 20 years, lots of ups and downs, of course. I would say that the most recent winters have been characterized by extremes. We had a very warm winter in 2011 into 2012. We had very cold, harsh winters, the worst winter since the 70s, back to back. 2013 into 14, 2014 into 2015, and then the last 2 winters have been remarkably warm in 2015-16 and the last winter in 2016-2017. So very volatile conditions over the last several winters. When we look at the snowfall, one thing for sure here, we've had more snowier than average winters than dry winters since the early 2000s. Over the last 15 years, we've only had 3 winters with below average snowfall. The most recent was 2 years ago. And again, despite the warm weather we had last winter, it was pretty close to average snow-wise. Now, how do we come up with these winter forecasts? You know, this is a little bit different than your 7-day forecast that you watch on the news or you get on your app. These are created differently. We're looking at a lot of different things. And part of what we do here when we want to make a seasonal forecast, including a winter forecast, is we look back at previous years that had similar conditions across the globe as compared to this year. We call those analogs. This year we have a La Nina going on. I'm going to talk about that more in just a second. We have other ocean oscillations and atmospheric oscillations that have some similarities to previous years. So we look back at those years and we see what happened in the winter season. What kind of winter did we have under those conditions? We have computer models that we look at. Computer models, of course, we use those making a forecast for the next 3 hours and 3 days, but we also use them when we're trying to make a forecast for 3 months. And part of this is experience and intuition. The more experienced you are, certainly the better you're going to get at any sort of weather forecasting, and I like to think that I've learned some lessons as I've made these forecasts over the last couple of years, including last year, which was not a great forecast. December was okay, but the forecast really went astray in January and February due to the remarkable warmth that no one really saw coming. There were lessons to be learned, and I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail as we go through this video. All right, you may have heard of La Nina. the opposite of El Nino. This is basically dealing with the water temperatures in the equatorial Pacific Ocean banked up against South America. Well, what in the world does that have to do with how much snow we're going to get and what kind of temperatures we're going to have in the winter? Well, the atmosphere and the oceans, they kind of play in the same sandbox. That sandbox is our planet. They're linked up. The ocean can make the atmosphere do things. It can make the jet stream do things. And when you have cool ocean waters, cooler than average ocean waters in this part of the Pacific, it can do things to the jet stream that influence weather patterns over North America, including in the U.S. Now, not every La Nina is the same, but in an average La Nina, this is the precipitation pattern that emerges. Wet pattern, Pacific Northwest, and heading down into parts of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. Dry in the Southwest and the Southern Plains. Now, there are exceptions to this. Again, not every La Nina is the same, and a lot of it depends on how strong or weak the La Nina is. This year's La Nina is expected to be a fairly weak one. And so the signal, the correlation, if you will, between La Nina and what kind of weather to expect over the U.S. is not as strong as if we had a strong La Nina. 2 years ago, when we had that first really warm winter, we had a very strong El Nino. And so that was one of the easier winter forecasts we made because the signal was so strong. It was a very, very strong El Nino, and the correlation is much stronger when you have a strong La Nina or El Nino with the weather that occurs up here. Here's a look at the current ocean water temperatures compared to average. Again, this is the area we're focused on, this cool water banked up against South America. That's not the only thing we look at, though. We look at ocean water temperatures on a global scale because all of it means something. La Nina is just one thing. We look at this cool water up here south of Alaska. This cool water west of Australia is interesting. And warm water off the coast, the east coast of North America. That also is interesting and can mean some things as far as the ocean atmosphere interaction. All right, last year's forecast went astray, not only mine, but just about everyone who did a winter forecast last year. No one saw the remarkable warmth in January and February coming. The number one culprit, I think, is this thing that I'm going to talk about here. It's called the QBO, which stands for Quasi-Biennial Oscillation. It's a mouthful. What this is a band of wind way, way up there in the stratosphere, above the troposphere and into the stratosphere, way up there. This belt of winds circles the globe right around, or right above, I should say, the equator. It switches directions roughly every 14 months. It's called a quasi-oscillation because it's not like clockwork. It's not exactly every 14 months. Sometimes the period is more like 16 months or 12 months or something like that. But it switches directions. Sometimes it's west and then it reverses and goes east. Well, so what? What does that have to do with anything? Well, studies have shown that when the QBO is in a westerly phase, that increases the chances for mild winter weather in our part of the U.S., in the eastern U.S. When it reverses and is in the easterly direction, that increases the chances, doesn't make it a mortal lock, but it increases the chances of cold winter weather, colder than average winter weather across the eastern U.S. Well, last year, the QBO was supposed to exit the westerly phase and enter that easterly phase. It didn't do that. It ramps back up into a record strong westerly phase. And that record intensity likely was a big, big driver of the warmth that we had last winter. So why did it do that? We don't know yet. Some speculation that the record El Nino we had a couple years ago led to this weirdness in the stratosphere. Some speculation about climate change perhaps influencing this. We just don't know at this point. But one thing for certain, this winter the QBO is set to behave as expected. It's back in that easterly phase, increasing the chances that we're not going to have ridiculous warmth that we had, or like we had last winter. All right, so I mentioned those analog years. Let's start getting into the forecast a little bit here. This is the list of the years most similar to this, I think, when it comes to the conditions in the atmosphere and in the oceans. There's 7 years or 7 seasons listed here. Notice that 5 of the 7 had colder than average winters, not by a ton. A degree or two, 81, 82, the biggest departure from average at 3.5. These are not real big numbers. Notice the snow in that right-hand column. Nothing tremendous here. None of our snowiest winters are on this list. In fact, a lot of these are below average. Our average annual snowfall in Youngstown at the airport in Trumbull County is in the mid-60s. It's 65, 66 inches. Now, of course, no one lives at the airport, but there is a variance throughout our viewing area, but at the airport we average in the mid-60s. So going by the analogs, we might think, oh, it's likely to be a somewhat chillier than average winter with perhaps a little bit below average snowfall. When we throw all those analog years into the hopper and take an average, this is what the map looks like. Definitely a cold signal across the northern Rockies, northern plains, kind of ho-hum in the southeast, and just slightly below average across most of Ohio and western PA. Now, those are the analogs. I told you one of the things we also look at, computer modeling. Computer modeling at this range, when we're talking 2, 3 months, 4 months ahead of time, has a spotty track record. Sometimes the models latch onto the right idea, sometimes they don't. It's not that much different, actually, than the computer models we use when we're trying to make a 3-day forecast. Computer models are just a tool. Meteorologists do not take computer models verbatim. Think of a computer model like a hammer. A hammer is not going to build a house on its own. It needs a skilled person operating the hammer. The hammer is also fairly useless if you have a completely unskilled person trying to use it. Your house is not going to get built correctly. So when we're talking about using computer models, you need a skilled, experienced meteorologist to interpret them and use them correctly. So certainly not going to take this map verbatim, but one thing I want you to take away from this is most of the modeling, including what I'm showing you here, is advertising a pretty warm winter again across much of the U.S., including Ohio and Pennsylvania. So that's, in stark contrast to the analogs that I just showed you, which are a little bit on the chilly side. The models are kind of in the opposite camp. So given all that information, let's start talking about the forecast first. We'll break it down month by month. I'm expecting December to be sort of similar to the regime we've been in over the last couple of months. September and October were pretty mild. November is likely to be pretty mild as well. Yes, there's going to be some cold days in November, but I expect November overall to finish as warmer than average. December's pattern to me looks fairly similar. There's going to be cold shots. It's going to snow in December, but when we look at the numbers at the end of the month, it'll probably shake out as somewhat warmer than average. This is in contrast to last December. We had a pretty fast start to winter last year. It snowed a fair amount. We had 23 inches of snow last December. It was colder than average. Of course, the whole thing flipped in January and February, but December was a legitimate winter month last year. I'm expecting this December to be a little more gentle. As far as January goes, this will also be a big change compared to last winter. January was very mild and relatively snow-free last winter. I'm expecting cold shots to swing through with more frequency and probably more intensity as we go into January. That's not exactly a real bold statement. January is typically our coldest month of the year. But compared to the averages, I would expect January to be in stark contrast to December and in stark contrast to last January. This could be a winter that's kind of characterized by big wild swings. When it gets cold, especially in January, it might get really cold. The kind of cold we really didn't see last winter. It's on the table that because there's going to be so much cold air building up across Canada, kind of up here, that anytime a little piece of that cuts loose, it could really be intense. And we could have, pockets, even if it only lasts a day or two, of pretty intense cold. Again, the kind of cold we haven't seen very often over the last couple of years. So that's what I think is a little more likely in January. There's going to be some mild stretches. There's going to be some cold stretches. It should come out in the wash as near to somewhat below average. By February, I'm expecting a little more of a pattern like December. Maybe not as warm compared to the average as December, but not as the cold shots will not be as frequent, I think, as we get into February. So that's why I have the month pretty much near average. Now February, an average February, it's a cold month. It's our second coldest month of the year. So yes, there's going to be plenty of cold weather, I think, in February. It's just compared to the averages, I don't see much of a signal either way. So when we look at winter as a whole, and when we talk about winter for our purposes, that's the months of December, January, and February, 3-month period. I'm expecting a winter that is near to slightly warmer than average. And so that's a big contrast to the last couple of years when we were 5 to 6 degrees above average. I'm expecting this year to be somewhere between 0 and 2 degrees above the average. I'm not expecting a harsh winter. I'm not expecting the kind of winters we had a few years ago, but I'm also not expecting the kind of winter we had last year or the year before. All right, as far as snow goes, here's a look at our viewing area in general, and I'm going to show you the list of snowfall predictions here. I'll get my head out of the way. No matter where you are on this map, all of these numbers are pretty close to average. So if you live in Sharon, probably around 60 inches worth of snow. If you live way up north, closer to the snow belts, up towards Kinsman and Greenville, you're probably pushing 70 to 80 inches worth of snow. Conversely, if you live in our southern viewing area, especially down towards Route 30, Lisbon, Hanoverton, Salineville, Calcutta, East Liverpool, you're probably more in the 35-ish, maybe 40-inch range. That is pretty typical annual or seasonal snowfall for these locations. So, I'm not expecting a big year snow-wise, not expecting the kind of year like we had 6 years ago, where at the airport we had like 118 inches of snow. Don't expect that. But I do expect a pretty typical year. Again, with the intensity of the cold shots, especially in January, being more noteworthy than the last couple of years. Lake effect could really go nuts for a while, especially if the lakes don't freeze over. We could have some big lake effect events that could really jack up the totals the farther north you are. Too early to really say on that, but I think, again, some of the cold will be fairly intense, more intense than we've seen the last couple of years, even if it only lasts a day or two, and that could really cause some lake effect bonanzas up in the snow belt. This is a month-by-month distribution of our typical snow during the course of the year. This year, I don't expect much deviation from this. I suspect our snowiest month will be January, with December and February not far behind. If I had to place my bets right now, I would say that maybe December is a little below average, and February is a little above average, and I think there's a chance that March could be a little above the average as well. We're 5 months out, and certainly my confidence in any forecast goes down as you get deeper into the winter and into next spring. But we had a pretty snowy March this last year, and we could have a repeat of that this year. I think March could end up being fairly active across the region. All right, let's talk about the bottom line. Not as warm as last year or the year before, but not unusually cold either. This isn't going to, I don't think this will go into the record books as a winter for the ages. Above average precipitation expected. That doesn't mean above average snowfall. We could have a lot of what I call slop storms, or even just cold rains, like today, 38 degrees and raining. We could have a lot of situations like that, especially in December. We could have a lot of storms that have some sleet and some freezing rain and kind of a mixed bag, and that would lead to the snowfall totals not being as high as they could be. So while precipitation overall might be above average, not expecting above average snow, I would put my forecast confidence this year as medium, higher than last year. Last year was a really tough forecast. This year, tough, but probably not quite as tough. The impacts on your life as we go into the winter. I'm expecting higher energy usage compared to the last couple of years. Furnaces did not have to work very hard in January and February last year. Again, not expecting a repeat of that this year. Last year, we had near average snowfall, so I would expect similar salt usage to last year. And of course, we live in Northeast Ohio and Western PA. Occasionally, we're going to have to be dealing with school adjustments, but not expecting a huge or unusual year for school adjustments this year. Again, when we look at our confidence in the forecast, I would put my lowest confidence in the temperatures, and I'll talk about that in just a second, a little more explanation on that. Medium confidence on the snow totals, and high confidence on the impacts, which I just talked about, and high confidence on the drivers of the winter weather pattern. And that would be La Nina, that would be that QBO thing that I talked about, and other things that I'm just not going to get into because I don't want this video to be an hour long. But the drivers of the winter pattern, fairly confident in those drivers behaving as expected this year. Now, what could go wrong with the forecast? Last year, the forecast went wrong with the warmth that showed up in January and February. A few things that I'm worried about, making me a little bit nervous coming out with this forecast. There's a chance, of course, that the models are out of touch and way too warm, and that the colder analog years are more correct than the models. And that would mean that my forecast is not cold enough. Conversely, it's possible that the models have the right idea, that this would be our third straight pretty warm winter. The atmosphere just wants to be warm right now. The last 2 years, since the fall of 2015, we've just had a hard time seeing sustained cold. And you almost want to dare the atmosphere to get cold and stay cold. So that's why I hesitated towards making the forecast colder, because it just seems like the atmosphere around our region wants to be warmer than average. We've only had a couple of cooler than average months in the last 2 years, and many, many more unusually warm months. And some drivers of the pattern, I talked about my high confidence in the big global patterns, but there are smaller features, and again, I'm not going to get into it because I don't want the video to be an hour long, but there are other factors to consider that are much harder to see a month or two out. These are things that we don't have much of a clue about until a few weeks out. They're hard to see more ahead than a few weeks, and so those things can screw up a winter forecast, and they have in the past, and it's possible that they will this year as well. So those are the things I'm nervous about. Again, I put my overall confidence in the forecast as higher than last year, not as high as a couple of years ago. All right, so winter's going to start showing its hand here over the next month to 6 weeks, and with that, I'm going to do an update to the forecast. In 1 month, on December 1st, I'll do this on TV, I'll do it online like this. I'm going to talk about how the forecast is shaping up. Might need to change some things. Maybe we won't have to change much. But by December 1st, we should certainly have an increased confidence in the pattern kind of showing its hand across the U.S. and across the globe for that matter. So we'll do a full update coming up in 1 month on December 1st. All right, for those who are still watching, and I've got 175 people still watching, really appreciate you sticking with me. I know this was long, really detailed, really geeky, and I really, really appreciate everyone sticking with me and checking out these annual winter forecasts. Put a lot of work into these. It's not just throwing darts at a dartboard, believe me. There's a lot of science and a lot of hard work that goes into making these forecasts. So I appreciate your attention. And you can watch this video if you want to go back and rewatch it. I'm going to post it on my YouTube channel, on my blog, on WFMJ.com. You can watch it on the app. I'll get all that online here over the next hour. In the meantime, hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday night, everyone. We'll see you.